Pale Queen.
"Peace be with you," Cassandra said, voice trembling as she placed a kiss on Sir Ramy's cold brow. A gallant man, quick with a joke and a smile. As a girl, he seemed to be a son unto himself, larger than life. People gravitated around him, so many seeking the warmth of his company. His smiling face would shine no more. Her gaze surveyed the palace that had once been her home, the scent of smoke overwhelming her senses as fire rushed through the palace, the screams of her people in the city below, threatening to crush her very spirit. So much had been lost. "My lady," Sir Weston said, voice tight and resolved, "we need to leave. Ramy's light has gone to the Creator. He'd not have wished us to grieve. Not now, anyhow." Lady? Of what? She wondered. Her kingdom was overrun, her father and mother struck down before her eyes, brothers murdered before they could rise and give account of themselves. Cassandra remembered her mother frowning at her as she watched Sir Weston whisper a joke in her ear. He'd long fancied her, and she him, ever since they were children, but their positions in life were too far apart to be considered a reality. Her mother's frown remained in place even after the crossbow bolt had taken the queen in the chest. Her father's laughter was cut off with a knife from a false servant. Men had rushed into the banquet hall in the grays and blues of the Hivite nation, cries of heretics and blasphemers hot on their lips as they spilled blood. A feast established to celebrate an end to the war between her people and the Hivites. Their kind words and relief, nothing more than a facade. Had Cassandra been sitting in her proper place, she would have joined her family on the path to the Creator. Sir Weston had saved her from dancing with a fool of a young lord that seemed to have been born without rhythm. The recently titled knight had unwittingly saved her from more than bruised toes. As it stood, she was the last of her line. Cracking wood signaled their pursuers as they attempted to break down the door. Sir Weston and the handful of his men watched warily, hands white-knuckling their swords as they prepared to make a stand. "Cassandra," Weston said, voice stern as he used her name without title. Free hand offered toward her. "We need to leave. If we hurry, we can make it to the stables before the Hivites." Cassandra's father had warned her of a day when the world would crumble. Her mother had a touch of the gift, a bit of magic from their sacred bloodline. It allowed her mother to see things, images of what might be. As the visions grew in intensity, her father, fearing for his nation, attempted to bring a peaceful resolution to the war. An act, it would seem, that only gave the vision life. "No," she said, looking up Sir Weston. "Take me to Mother's study." Weston's face went pale. "There's no escape from there, Cassandra. If we go, you'll die, or worse." The knight's face twisted in a grimace. Cassandra's mother always told her she had the gift as well. She claimed it was greater than her own by leaps and bounds, but said it was a sleeping thing and best left that way. That the price of power was not worth the burden on her soul. Because of this, Cassandra was never allowed in her mother's study. She worried that something there might awaken the gift within her. Ignoring Sir Weston's offered hand, she stood, holding herself apart. She was queen now, she thought. It was time to behave like one. "Take me to her study," she said, putting steel in her voice, as her father had done so many times. "That is my command." Weston's eyes hardened to fine points. For a brief moment, she thought he would refuse. She stood taller, fear of his rejection blooming anger in her chest. Now that the capital was in flames, there was nothing preventing Weston or his men from leaving, only their oaths to her father and their family. Cassandra refused to let her fear show. The doors cracked even further behind them, voices from the other side yelling at one another to hurry. Weston's gaze went from her to the doors. "As you wish," he said, voice softening. "You can't be serious, West. She's just a girl," said one of the soldiers. "Pick her up and let's get out while we can," called another. Weston went still. We'll go to the Queen's study. Any word in protest will be considered treason." Those who hadn't spoken began to back away from the knight and the two protesting soldiers. None offered support from either side, and Cassandra realized that they were waiting for a resolution. Part of her was mortified that her word held so little sway, but her eyes were open to the reality of her situation. Without warriors loyal to her name, she was nothing in their eyes. "Don't do this, Wes," said the first, slowly shifting his feet. "I'd have died for the king and queen, but they're gone. I'll not die for her." Weston hadn't moved, his eyes fixed, face drawn. "That bitch'll get us all," began the second, but Weston's sword moved faster than any eye could follow, cutting out his throat. Weston moved to the remaining soldier, their blades clashing in a brief exchange before the knight withdrew and the soldier fell to the ground, clutching his thigh as blood pumped from the open wound. "You son of a bitch," the dying man said, half disbelief as he struggled to stave off the spouting blood. Had she not just witnessed the death of her entire family, this sudden act of violence might have shocked her. As it stood, Cassandra just felt numb. She saw the pain in Weston's face as he stared down at the dying man and felt a wave of guilt hit her. It only intensified as she realized how relieved she was. "I'm sorry, my friend," whispered Weston, before he turned to Cassandra, clearing his throat before he spoke. "Let's go to the study." She nodded, unable to speak lest her voice break and she ruined the image of authority she'd taken on. "With me," Weston called, leading them through one of the back hallways. Minutes after they fled, Cassandra heard the distant sound of triumph as Hivites broke through. She watched the men around her, seeing the realization hit each of them as their only way out of the palace was cut off. If she didn't find something in her mother's study, she'd effectively consign them all to death. As they came upon the antechamber leading into her mother's study, Weston called out to his men, "Hold here. They'll not realize we've gone a different route until they reach the stables. We'll buy the Queen time to find what she needs." Cassandra's eyes found Weston's, and she saw the desperation there. In his mind, he'd just led what remained of his men to die, and he'd done it for her. She couldn't stop herself from reaching out and holding his hand, warm and sticky with blood. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his hand and rising on her feet to kiss his cheek. For a moment his face softened, and she saw the young boy she remembered from her childhood, the same youth that had saved her from all the imaginary beasts and villains when the world was not so cruel. Now the villains were real. Shouts called out from down the hallway they'd come, and the boy was gone, replaced by the warrior he'd become. "Go, my lady. We'll hold as long as we can." Weston strode out to stand at the front of his men, eyes fixed on the only route into the room. Cassandra tore her blurring gaze away from her companion and hurried to the next room, swinging the door close and a hollow echo through the study. She'd only ever seen this place from the antechamber, never realizing just how small it really was. Her imagination created a vast room filled with hidden chambers and small alcoves where secret knowledge could be gained. Instead, she found herself standing before a room a little larger than the antechamber she'd left behind, covered in bookshelves. A few lounging chairs were tastefully placed, while a single desk rested at the other end. She felt the weight of her actions with every disappointed step. She had thought to find a trove of secrets that might help her awaken the gift within, the power her mother had been so fearful of. Yet all she could see were old books and an oddly lit, windowless room. There was a faint whisper ahead of her, a voice of sorts, but distant, faded. Cassandra looked up in the direction of the sound and stopped. Rather than candelabras illuminating the room, as she expected, Cassandra found herself staring at specifically placed blue stones, each emanating a pale light throughout the room, though she knew not how. Connecting them were ever-shifting tendrils of light. She followed the strange lights as the tendrils seemed to coalesce at one point above the desk at the other side of the room. Something about it drew her forward, as if a voice called her name, clarifying as she drew closer to the main source of light. The central stone was larger than the rest. Held in place by silver latticework that wound down the wall to the desk below, something lay there, slowly pulsating, each pulse reflected in the stones around the room. Sudden cries rose up behind her, the clash of steel and screams of the dying as battle was joined in the antechamber. The Hivites had found them. Cassandra picked up her pace, approaching the source at her mother's desk, the voice growing stronger the closer she got, until she could hear her name loud and clear. There, laying atop the small pedestal on the desk, was a glass-like shard, similar color to the stones around the room. Suddenly the voice seemed to rush toward her. "Embrace me, daughter of flame. Embrace me and awaken," it hissed. Cassandra froze as the disembodied whisper echoed in her mind. Dread filled her heart at the sound of it. There was no doubt that there was something sinister there, hiding within this shard. Her mother had spoken of a price, but she had no clue what it would be, or how much it would cost. She could hear Weston shouting somewhere beyond, but couldn't look away from the pulsating shard. His voice was breaking as he ordered his men to hold while someone pounded on the door, begging for salvation. "Embrace me and save them." Her hand shaking, Cassandra reached out. An image popped into her mind, and in that moment she knew what had to be done. Cassandra gripped the shard, breath coming out in panicked rush as she gathered her courage. She pictured her mother and father, her brothers, all dead at the hands of those who broke their word. The many servants and soldiers who died in these moments of betrayal. She pictured Weston. With one quick motion, she thrust the shard into her heart and screamed. Sir Weston sagged against the overturned chair, watching his lifeblood pool on the marble floor. His men lay among the heaps of dead, along with dozens of Hivites. He could hear more approaching, come to take the last of the line, come to take his queen. He glanced back at the doorway, wishing that he could see her one last time before the end. This was a fool's errand. He'd known that even before he killed Tobias. It wasn't right what he did. Tobias had been a good man and a better friend. It had been for Cassandra. For her, he'd butcher the world. He was sure he'd pay for his sins. The approaching footsteps guaranteed it. Weston reached a hand to his face where she'd kissed him, forgetting he was missing the fingers required to touch his cheek. A voice called out, and Weston looked to see more Hivites had arrived. They paused, seeing the terrible scene of carnage before them. His men had taken a heavy toll in such a small space. The blood had been unable to flow in any other direction but down the hall, forming a path of gore leading these men to him. Weston pushed himself up to his feet. Searing agony flared in his chest where the sword thrust had punctured his breastplate. He struggled for air as he brought his sword up into a guard position. "They say traitors are sent to the lowest point of the void," Weston told them. "I've prepared a sample of what awaits. Join me, would you?" There was a momentary pause as those in the front took in the hellscape he'd created. Weston didn't wait. Lurching forward, he severed the tendons of the first man's sword arm and crushed another man's skull with his pommel before they swarmed over him. Blades sank into his flesh, and he lashed out, teeth bared like the dying animal he'd become. No thought for skill or deceit. He lashed out with all the power left in him. All for her. Then the pain faded, blades stopped entering him, and he fell to the ground. He could still hear screams all around him, thinking this must be the first steps into the void. Pale light flashed and hot gore splattered on his face. Weston blinked several times as he watched a Hivite soldier above him, held in place by a tendril of pale blue light, before a similar hued stone was thrust through his chest. The body was tossed away as the tendril of light sought another victim. Weston pushed himself up, trying to see what was going on, but there was no strength in him, and he fell back. The world began to spin before fading. The screams died away, and soon he felt like he was floating. He opened his eyes as pale light surrounded him, and there she was. His eyes blurred as he tried to focus on Cassandra's face. Something had changed. Her eyes had grown white, her skin so pale. "My lady," he whispered, but a cold finger pressed against his lips. "Hush, my knight. You've done well," she said. A strange voice seemed to follow just behind her words. He tried to speak again, but found himself drifting, only to feel a cold shock enter his chest, drawing him back. For a moment his vision cleared, and he could see that he was held aloft by the same tendrils of pale blue light. Large stones floated all about them, while the bodies of dead Hivites covered the walls and floors, torn apart by means beyond mortal men. Cassandra floated with him, beckoning one of the stones forward. "Poor Weston," she said, caressing his face. "You've ruined yourself for me." He nodded, staring up at the new Cassandra, mind unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Drawing a pale sliver from one of the floating stones and holding it out before him, she said, "Would you serve me, my knight? Would you give yourself beyond what you already have?" Weston stared into her changed visage, the cold gaze in her eyes. A part of him knew that she had delved into something terrible, some power beyond what the Creator designed, and yet she was still Cassandra. He nodded. Her dark lips pulled back in a smile. "Embrace me." Weston somehow found the strength to rise, just as she thrust the sliver into his heart. Cold, terrible pain flowed through him, drawing out a scream from his broken lips. Ice flowed through his veins as newfound power rushed into his body. The pain subsided, and the tendrils slowly drew him to the ground. Weston felt renewed, alive, and every ounce of hate Cassandra felt for the enemy in her city. He could sense her desire for revenge, for justice, and a craving for power he'd never imagined she contained. "Are you prepared for what lay ahead, my knight?" she asked. He gazed up at his queen, at the terrible beauty she was, and kneeled in the vast pool of blood. "As you command, my queen."
If it's gonna get violent tonight, tell me you're gonna be alright. You're gonna be. It's an eye for an eye, and I don't know if I want you to fight, want you to fight.